to knowing what the local needs are. Then there's a lot of discussion around how do we meet those needs, who contributes, how do we make it in a way that ensure global equity. From our side, we are less, as UNV, involved in the policy setting of those discussions, but very much involved at the local level in making difference one individual and one community at a time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for laying the grounds here a little bit. I want to actually start with thinking a little bit about what we actually mean by equity. It's such a buzzword, you know, and you have raised all these different dimensions, from procedural to regional to social to distributional, access to resources. So outcome versus, you know, process equities. What I really mean here, though, is if you go into a small community, you work in different places. You go, you know, into Mexico, you go into Venezuela, you go into a different, whatever, Asia, some other community. Do we all mean the same thing? And given that so often we need supra-local solutions to the problems that cause inequities, do we have a common understanding that transcends all those differences? How do we deal with the tensions between what people mean, what we mean, and, you know, the differences that we actually work with? Anyone who would like to tackle that?
Yeah, we have one big problem. Normally we lead, or we put equity together with development, no? What did we have with these 5 decades of development? At least 3 to 4 billion people in poverty. 70% of them women in problems. So I think the paradigm, precisely this global paradigm of development, and if you look at the distribution process, so we know at the moment that around 85 to 89% of all the goods, all the saving, all the disposal processes we have are in hand of 1/5 of world society. And this is the model that we got somewhere proposed from top-down, international organization, financial system, and obviously far away of the necessity that we have from the region and from the local level, and obviously on the cost, because what was going on with this model is an enormous increase of social inequity within the country, within social groups, within gender lines, and within age. So I think we have to change the paradigm, and for this reason I'm threatened when you are proposing a global process. I want much more go to the model you proposed, doing network analysis, doing the projects from bottom up, trying to find with whom I want to ally. I don't trust this model, so I want to ally with yours. Let me do this in a way with my culture, with my economic, with my social resources and environmental resources. Let us try to find, and I was so glad that you spoke about happiness, because this means it's not only a problem of material process, it's a problem of how I relate. And there is a study, you know, there is a happiness index, and it was very, very interesting to look at it. Most of these rich countries who have 85 or 90% of all the goods, everything resolved, are the most unhappy countries. And the people who have to struggle, I don't know if it's just the interest to struggle all the time that maintains us in some happiness. So I think we need a paradigm shift, and precisely with the environmental challenges we had at this moment, obviously we can't continue with this model. We have to do a paradigm shift. It costs a lot because it will cost the people who have the power in hand. They have to give up. They have to think about alternatives. We have them, we are doing them. And I prefer the survival strategies.
Robin, I want to put this question to you too, since you actually work in an institution that, you know, reaches into all continents. And do you have one definition and you impose it on the rest of the world, or how do you handle that?
No, I mean, the short answer to that is no, absolutely not. I'm not going to try to define equity. I mean, I'm certainly not going to take a sort of an institutional position on this, but I just want to share some personal reflections on the dimensions of equity that I think are important in the work that we're engaged with. And I mean, you know, the mission, the mandate of the World Bank is to fight world poverty. That's what the World Bank was actually created to do. And there's been a lot of change in thinking about approaches to poverty over the years. And one of the central distinctions is in, you know, whether you're looking at levels of income or you're looking at there are multiple dimensions of poverty. A critical one with respect to climate change is vulnerability. And we know from a great deal of analytical work and applied research and so on, we know that, and participatory poverty assessments, I would say, because this has been a very important source of information, asking the poor themselves what they regard as the key dimensions of ill-being in their lives, what characterizes that. Very often, it's a question of low levels of asset holding, and it's a variety of kinds of assets that help build up resilience in the face of climate and non-climate related hazards. And so in the work that I'm sort of involved with, very often equity means basically who gets what within society, and it's the distribution of power and control over the structural factors that determine who controls asset levels, essentially. I mean, that really is, it's the power relations behind those distributional questions around assets that are far more important than the determinants of necessarily levels of income, which don't really have a great bearing whatsoever on whether or not you're able to withstand climate-related shocks and stresses. And so, for me, it's those kinds of issues. And again, I could give some sort of practical illustrations of some of that. I don't know if we've got time to get into it now, but perhaps I'll come back.
Why don't you give one, and then I'll pick up on what you said and move it on. Yeah. Okay,
just one example. I've worked a good deal in Mongolia over the years, and particularly with pastoralists. Pastoralists are vulnerable to a variety of climate-related shocks. They're accustomed to adapting to climate variability. That's a sort of a critical feature of pastoral livelihood systems. In Mongolia, pastoralists are exposed to both the risk of drought, episodic drought events, but also phenomena known as dzud, which are very harsh winter-spring conditions that lead to high levels of livestock mortality. It's combinations of sort of ice covering pasture, extreme low temperatures, heavy snow cover, but the net result is that animals can't get access to grazing, and so they die. And that has a tremendous impact on human livelihoods. Now, Mongolia, I was responsible for the World Bank's rural development program in Mongolia for a number of years. And essentially, we were providing a lot of support to the government's efforts to reduce poverty. And the classic approach from the mid-1990s onwards was a classic sort of social fund type approach, which is basically aimed at trying to improve levels of income. And this was achieved through a variety of public works schemes which helped create basic infrastructure. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, levels of basic infrastructure sort of were eroded. Human development gains in health and education and so on were slipping away, having been at really very high levels in Mongolia, given the GDP of the country. And so, you know, investments in infrastructure were important. They were a key element of livelihood security, if you like. And people involved in these schemes would earn an income, but it was short-lived, it was temporary. It wasn't actually getting at some of the structural factors that have a bearing on whether or not people are vulnerable to drought or dzud events. As it happened, there were no sort of serious, major sort of countrywide climate-related shocks over the period from the mid-90s up until the turn of that decade, 1999-2000. And then, suddenly, and this came as no surprise to pastoralists who are, you know, experienced herders at least who are used to dealing with these things. There was a sequence of 3 consecutive years of very, very harsh dzud events, often preceded by drought. And so it was a key moment of opportunity, quite frankly.